If you're watching this video, there's a very good chance you've sunk your teeth into Arma Reforger and you've enjoyed the basics and you've gotten a good grasp of how things work to some extent. But for a lot of people, the huge sandbox environment that is Arma Reforger and all of the different assets, vehicles, weapons, and things that you could utilize in the field feel very intimidating at times. And the step from understanding the basics and being a regular rifleman who's capable of capping a few objectives to being somebody who can master the tools of the trade of every kind of vehicle and also understand some of the more complex things in different parts of the game is a bit of a leap. With a game like Arma Reforger, there are huge amounts of assets that are available to your disposal, and things that you're going to want to try out and get good with and practice with so that you can use them in-game and feel confident doing it. In a game that's so heavily reliant on things like resources and frontline attacks and defending, feeling like you've slipped up because you used something new and it didn't work out for the first time can be a bit of a drawback. But understanding certain systems in Arma Reforger, and most importantly, being able to get the fun out of all of the tools available to you, is a really big thing, and that's what this video will help with today. So to do this process of understanding more advanced complexities of Arma Reforger and how you can better yourself in this game, understand the sandbox environment, understand its systems, you need to use Game Master. And this is something that some players don't even know exists. For some of you who are longtime Arma fans, I'm sure this will be very familiar. But if you go straight into the Scenarios tab here and scroll down, you will see something listed like Game Master Ireland and Game Master Everon. And you can literally load into any given instance of Arma and play around with all of the assets not only in the vanilla version of the game, but also any mods that you've downloaded as well are automatically available in any Game Master instance. Now, if you load into this and it fails after you hit the play button and it says so-and-so mod failed to load, you can simply go up to the mod tab here, then go into the mod manager, and then you can instantly disable all of your mods and stick them on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side by clicking these. Now, I have a couple of these enabled because I want a couple of assets to show you guys and a few things that I think a lot of people use, for example, some of the WCS assets. But generally speaking, whenever you're going into Game Master, less mods tend to work a little bit better, and certain mods will cause some trouble, especially ones that are a little less looked after, for example, or mods that are a little bit out of date. So I will put the M1 AMROBs over for the instances of what we're doing here, and then simply go back, hit Scenarios, scroll on down to Game Master, and hit play. So this is Game Master, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with what Game Master is, it literally is what it says on the tin. If you've played something like Dungeons & Dragons or whatever it so happens to be, a Game Master is literally somebody who is in control of the instance that you are playing. Game Masters can exist on modded servers and multiplayer servers and vanilla servers and have executive control over certain things that are happening around them, spawning in different vehicles, spawning in different AI, spawning in different factions, whatever it so happens to be. So right now, we're literally hovering over Montignac, and I can go entirely anywhere on the entire map of this, move my players, move my characters, and suddenly I'm all the way down here at Coastal Morton. It's an entire free-flowing world for you to do whatever you want with at any given time. You can change playable factions. You can change what time of day it is. For example, I can make it 5:30 in the morning. You can change the date. You can change the weather. You can do quite literally whatever you want in Game Master. And there are tons of different options for you to mess around with. For the purposes of this, I'm going to leave automated weather and wind on, but you can mess around with things. Fuel consumption, consciousness, bleeding, health regeneration. There are loads of different options that you can sort of try and test with to produce some different and interesting scenarios in a game. But for what we're using Game Master for is simply understanding the complexities of different assets that we have in the game, understanding different vehicles, and also understanding different fundamentals like the ballistic system that exists in Arma Reforger. So to do this, I'm literally going to go and teleport us all the way over to this little airfield. I think it's always a great little place to do some testing. And this is what Game Master is all about. Now, on PC, it's tab, but I'm sure there'll be different controls if you're on console. You have the ability to pull up an entire entity browser, which is literally a collection of every asset in the game. This includes vanilla assets, for example, like this rifle squad that you're seeing here, and it also includes modded assets if you have them loaded. So if I spawn in, for example, a Special Forces squadron, or if I spawn in a Grenadier team who are American, and I happen to hit play, these guys will just shoot each other. All very well and good, AI being AI, I can then delete some of those entities, I can even cast a lightning bolt to massively delete them. But you might be wondering, well, why is this useful and what do I use it for? Well, what you can actually do with any of these entities is right-click them, depends on your controls, of course, if you're using a controller, and then take control of that character. You can then literally use their entire inventory assets, you can test out the weapons that they have, you can do everything that you could do in a regular version of Arma with this character that you have. And then by holding Y again, you can quite literally go back into Game Master and delete those assets at any given whim. Now, using this entity browser and the area around you in any part of the map, you can learn pretty much anything you want to learn about Arma Reforger, both in terms of modded assets and vanilla assets, to understand what they're capable of, what they can do, and how you can use them. So for example, if you're somebody who has decided, hey, look, I feel like a pretty, competent player, but I haven't actually tried any helicopters yet, and I kind of want to understand how those all work, you can then spawn in a vehicle, go find yourself a helicopter, and whether it's a modded asset or a vanilla asset, take it in, hop in, take control of this player, and instantly use this however you want. So this is a really great way of trying out vanilla assets in the game, but also trying out some of the more complex assets in modded servers that perhaps you haven't been able to get your hands on. Servers like WCS and some of the Vietnam stuff has been really, really popular, but if you don't know all of the assets in those servers and how to use them, you might find them quite intimidating. And if you find them quite intimidating, there's a very good chance that you've never tried using them in-game, and then this vicious cycle of not being willing to test something because you're not sure about it, and then not using it and having potentially less fun kind of repeats itself. So I've just spawned in this helicopter, this is a basic vanilla transport helo, and I can mess around with it. I can learn how it flies, I can learn what the different controls and HUD elements look like and what they do. And if it all goes horrifically, horribly wrong and I crash it into the floor, I hold Y, and I instantly find myself back in the Game Master, and then I can go and delete this helicopter, and then I can instantly spawn in another one and repeat the process and learn from my own mistakes and errors at my own pace, doing whatever I want. If you're somebody who plays on modded servers, this is a really good opportunity to learn systems in the game that perhaps you haven't had the chance to learn from. So for example, you have to reach Major in order to use any of the armed little birds in servers like WCS. But if you haven't been able to do that, chances are you've literally never ever used a little bird, you don't know how it works, you don't know what weapons it's got, you don't know what the different types of little birds are and what they use, and you've never known what to do with it. Well, in Game Master, you spawn one in, you spawn in a character, you can mess around with things, take control, and you can find out, for example, that this little bird that I'm using right now has a variety of different assets. It has 2 anti-aircraft Stinger missiles, which are quite literally lock-ons. It has a 7.6251 main gun, and it also has a bunch of high explosive rounds that you can utilize. So again, same principle as before, I can spawn in, mess around with this, and you know what the best part about this is? I can even find out how, for example, this little bird might interact with a slightly different asset. So let's spawn in, for this example, another vehicle. Let's go for something slightly heavier, like one of these. Let's go for an Mi-8 transport helicopter. I can then go back into this, take control again, and go, okay, well, I want to find out what this little bird does to this helicopter. How many shots will it take with a 7.6251 main gun in order to cause damage? Where do I need to hit the helicopter to inflict the most damage? You can see, for example, on an initial strafe run here, that helicopter's actually done pretty well. The main rotor's up, it's definitely taken some hits, it's smoking a little bit, and here instantly you can learn that 7.6251 is highly effective at light vehicles like this helicopter. Effective enough that it worked almost instantaneously. And you can also learn, for example, if you wanted to, how the different types of missiles work, like a H-explosive round, or specifically a Stinger round like this, how it would lock on and interact with one of those helicopters. Simple as. Something that you probably previously would have never done before, never tried before, never understood before, is instantly available at your disposal for you to understand not only the asset that's in your hands, but how that asset interacts with other vehicles. And there are some really great examples of things that people don't understand about this game that are hidden away in this. So for example, I'm going to go ahead here and delete these characters and show you guys that even in the vanilla version of this game, there are things that people don't know. So if I spawn in, let's go for, again, our Mi-8. This is the same Mi-8, but with a small amount of armament to some extent. And then if I spawn in a default vanilla version of the game, let's go for a light AT rifleman and then an automatic rifleman, I can show you guys a couple of things that you probably didn't know before. I'm going to take control of this rifleman here, and using a machine gun, I'm going to show you guys how you can do things like take out the main propeller of a helicopter just with a machine gun. Why? Because this machine gun has the ability to do that. Arma Reforger has a full-blown ballistic system, and this machine gun uses M855, which is, of course, just a 5.56 variant. Then I can, for example, go back in and show you how a light AT might interact with one of these helicopters. Where would I need to aim? For example, if I aim for the side of the helicopter here at the back, it doesn't do a huge amount. But if you aim for the main jet engine at the top here and the propulsion system, you may find yourself with a little bit more success. So if I go back into Game Master, right-click this guy, end up deleting him and spawning in another one just because it's probably a little bit quicker, I could spawn in another quick anti-tank soldier and show you that if I aim this law more at the propulsion system at the top of the vehicle, it's more likely to ignite the fuel system and more likely to cause this helicopter to be destroyed more quickly. And this applies to everything. Every vehicle has its own ballistic asset, every vehicle has weak points, every vehicle has situations and parts of it that you need to understand in terms of how it works. It's entirely capable that you can take out one of the rear rotors of this just by using a standard 5.56 weapon, but concentrating your fire on a rear rotor. Granted, that's a lot easier to do when it's on the ground and not something that when it's like in the sky, but it is possible to damage this rear rotor just by using standard weapons. And you can see that the M249 machine gun was much more effective at taking out the propeller than something like this basic rifle. And in an in-game scenario where it's flying by, unless I can hit the pilot, using something like this weapon just simply wouldn't be worth my time. This is also a great way of figuring stuff out like modded assets as well. You know, there's lots of things that people don't understand about modded assets in this game. I always like to give the example of some of the vehicles in the mods as well that are a little bit complex, a little bit complicated, that people don't entirely understand. So for example, I'm going to use a basic BTR 70 here, just as an example of this. I know this is something that's also available in the vanilla version of the games. And then I'm going to spawn in an Abrams, okay? So one of the most highly heavy armored modded assets that you can get in the game, and just give you an example of something that you could learn by doing this. Very quickly, spawn in an officer, take control of the officer, and you're going to learn the ability that this has as a BTR in terms of what a 30mm cannon that this has is capable of doing against something like an armed Abrams tank. And you can learn what, for example, 14x5 by 114mm is capable of, as well as some 6.2 5.4. So I'm going to aim this just at the rear of the Abrams tank. And you can see pretty much fairly early on that it's not going to be highly effective. You're going to see that, you know, this Abrams, when I hop into it shortly, with 14.5 by 114, isn't the most sufficient type of armament and ballistic system in order to deal with it. And I guess this kind of just goes to show that what it says on the tin makes sense. You know, high caliber assets like 30mm cannons could probably do something to an Abrams, but something like a BTR perhaps isn't going to be your most effective tool. If I then decide to move on over here and hop into what we've got here, I can show you a very similar instance. So if I hop in here at the gunner seat or the commander seat, you can see the inside of this isn't completely done because it's a modded asset. You can pretty much see that this tank has suffered more or less no damage. But a 120mm smoothbore against something like a BTR, instant detonation because it's a 120mm cannon that's going straight into it. And just like that, you've learned a very pivotal lesson that a BTR cannot challenge heavy armor on modded servers. Something like a Bradley or a KH-17 probably could do some damage to this, especially with TOW missiles, which are highly effective against all kinds of armor. But unless you've tried these things, unless you've messed around with them, there's a good chance that you never would have known that. There's a good chance that you never would have known that something like a BTR, despite its look and despite its size, isn't capable of challenging something like an M1 Abrams. And to some of you, whilst that might be entirely obvious, like myself, for most people that isn't. And a lot of people don't know the quirks of this game and fail to understand them. They'll also fail to understand, for example, that if I spawn in a BTR, and then I go ahead and spawn in something like this light armored vehicle with a 50 cal turret on the top of it, a lot of people wouldn't understand that a 50 caliber gun like this, because it is quite literally a 50 cal, or in this case, this is, this is one of the more basic 50 cal turrets, is actually capable of doing pretty heavy damage to something like a BTR and damaging parts of it. You know, it's not the kind of thing where you're going to get an instant deletion on a BTR, but you know what? A single mag, and I've already got it smoking a little bit. So if a BTR finds itself, you know, in a situation where it's struggling to locate you because it has sort of limited optics and limited range, you know now that an M2HB mounted onto the top of this, a 50 cal weapon, is actually capable of doing some pretty serious damage to one of these vehicles, despite the fact that there's a clear size mismatch and a clear armament mismatch. This is a machine gun capable of knocking out one of those vehicles and destroying a higher powered asset. The reason I'm showing you guys what Game Master is capable of in terms of a playground is that I'm showing you that you can learn a lot about lots of different parts of this game in less than half an hour or an hour. If you spent just an hour in Game Master, you would learn things about modded versions and vanilla versions of this game that you wouldn't have possibly understood before. So intimidating optics like this small sight, you could learn a little bit about what it's capable of doing. You could also learn, for example, that firing on this here Typhoon, despite its size and strength as a 30mm weapon, a direct hit to the engine block will always ignite it, setting it on fire and rendering it an entirely useless asset, burning everybody inside. But a Typhoon can survive side-on shots, and I will show you a quick example of that by, once again, loading up our little asset manager here. And we'll quickly spawn in another one of these here Typhoons. Scrolling on down. Another one of these Typhoons, similar range, you know, not really doing anything entirely special. I'm going to take control of this character again using the exact same rocket round. Connect this bad boy in the HEDP. Now, if I hit this Typhoon in the side or the turret, I probably will knock out or possibly even kill the people inside of it, but I won't get an entire detonation off of it, meaning that it's going to require a second missile, or me removing the casualties, or me finishing off the people inside. So this Typhoon, entirely fine. And in fact, I can prove that people would live inside it by spawning people in, putting them inside the vehicle, and then repeating the process. But you can see that you can learn a lot about the ballistic system in this game, how certain assets work, how certain things work, just by hopping on in it. And there are entire assets in the game, modded and unmodded, like this here KH-17, that you can learn just so much about just by messing around with in this Game Master. The K-17 Epoch is my favorite example of one of those weird, quirky modded things that you just wouldn't know a huge amount about. K-17 is basically the Russian equivalent of the Bradley in the modded version of the game. And a lot of people don't know that the K-17 is capable of tracking assets in real time as a gunner. So a good example of this, I'm going to spawn in a little helicopter here. Take control of this again. And here you can see in the gun, not only do I have the ability to stabilize this by pressing space, meaning that my turret is stable, if I double tap space, you see this yellow lock on. And if this helicopter moves, and I use my armor-piercing rounds, which you can see in the bottom right corner, it will track it in real time, even whilst it's flying. And you can learn what a 30mm cannon is capable of doing against something like this. And a really good example of this, in terms of how assets are very uniquely different, I am firing a 30 by 165mm armor-piercing cannon at this thing. And because I'm only hitting it in the sides and back, and I haven't hit any of its ammunition up by its turret, or I haven't hit its engine block, which I'm now aiming for more actively, it's perfectly fine. And the Typhoon can take a beating. Pretty much anybody inside this vehicle probably would be dead at this point. But again, you just have to be aware of these things and what they're capable of doing, and how aiming for certain parts of an asset, like for example in this Typhoon, if I decide to aim for the back and rear armor, which tends to be a little bit more prone, or specifically the ammunition parts of it in between the turret and the base of the vehicle, you may see more success in certain scenarios and less success in other scenarios. You can also learn how high explosive rounds are different to armor-piercing rounds, how they work, how a 7.62 is probably capable of shooting out the tires and not much more, and how a tow missile would probably instantly delete it on any given occasion. Every single asset in this game is your toy and your playground if you use Game Master effectively, and you can learn so much about modded and vanilla assets in this game, like the ability of machine guns to knock out helicopters, like the tracking abilities of a K-17 Epoch, like the ability of a Bradley to use turret stabilization and tow missiles to lock out air assets and ground assets, simply just by playing around with them. So when push comes to shove and there's a K-17 in the area, you'll know that with certain assets in the game and aiming for certain parts of that vehicle, you can inflict the most amount of damage as fast as humanly possible. And the basic convention of military knowledge does actually apply to something like Arma Reforger. For example, everybody knows that the weakest part of a tank or an armored vehicle tends to be the rear, and the same still applies in this game. But for the most part, there are also other things you need to learn, like where are the ammo compartments? Can my ammo rack certain vehicles by shooting parts of it that will force it to detonate? Which in something like a K-17 is entirely possible. Is there an engine block or engine component that I can aim for, like for example with a Typhoon? And that also applies to vanilla assets like propellers and engine blocks that they'll have, and the soon-to-be introduced infantry fighting vehicles that will feature in the vanilla version of the game as well. We're going to switch gears a little bit away from the functionalities of Game Master to talk a little bit more about playstyles and how you can maximize your effectiveness in terms of logistics pipelines and taking out infantry. Now, lots of people tend to focus on objectives, and that's absolutely great. We're going to use this example here of Montignac, Provence, and Fagari to talk about how people would flow from these objectives, fight each other around these roads, and try and take over and overwhelm one another. But the big thing about Arma Reforger is that I believe personally there are two playstyles. One playstyle is called the Enabler, the other playstyle is called the Preventer. Now, an Enabler is somebody who enables the flow of assets to a point by doing things like spawning in a command truck. So, for example, if I was trying to capture Montignac, a good place to put a command truck might be in this compound here, or in this dense forest line over here where it's difficult to find. And it just means that as an enabling player, you're either flowing supplies, assets, or critical things like command vehicles into areas to allow the average player around you to reinforce a position. Being an enabler is a little bit like being a game master in itself. So for example, if I know that Montignac is currently the point that we want to push, I would be heavily supplying Fagari, or I would be heavily supplying something like Entre Deux, or I'd be heavily supplying a nearby location in order to make that more of a reality, because people will choose the closest available location to that point to get to it. If Montignac is the general point of emphasis that people are going for, I know that people will probably spawn at this military hospital down here in order to push it straight down this main road, because that's just how people work. They aim for the shortest possible amount of distance in order to achieve their goal, with the least amount of driving or on-foot behavior that they have to do. So as an enabler playstyle, I'm supplying the most nearby local points. I'm getting vehicle assets in that area. I'm also doing things like spawning in command trucks or radio antennas or radio arrays, whatever it so happens to be, to give people more spawn options in that area. Logistics, supplies, critical assets, that is what the enabler playstyle is about. And a lot of you guys who do logistics runs without realizing it are enabler players who force the flow of gameplay to go through a certain location. So I think those are a really good example to start with, and I think people who run logistics maybe don't realize this, but you're the backbone of the gameplay. You know, logistically, in terms of how people flow from point A to point B, if there is a good flow of supplies, a good flow of assets, a good flow of weaponry, people will naturally tend to gravitate towards it in order to achieve that goal. But the second playstyle is the Preventer. Now, the Preventer, in my view, is probably one of the most critical playstyles in the game, and something that not a lot of people do. These are the people that move away from the ebb and flow and combat of, yeah, I want to capture Montignac, and start thinking to themselves, well, if I want my team to capture Montignac, and the enemy are advancing from the north to the south, how can I do that? And most people would say the intelligent answer to that is to set up in this bush line over here, giving you full range control of the primary road into the objective. And you'd be entirely correct, and I do this all the time in my live streams constantly. I like to use Provence as a staging area for an ambush not only into Fagari but also into Montignac, but sometimes I like to take it a step further. I like to really think about, if the enemy team, for example, is spawning in the south here at St. Pierre, well, the best possible opportunity in terms of me ambushing them early on in the game is probably over here. The preventing style of gameplay and how you can ambush opponents using assets like RPGs, laws, and vehicles is probably one of the hardest parts of the game, because it means you have to get behind enemy lines without being noticed, into critical locations, And you also have to recognize how people might flow around you. So for example, if I'm trying to ambush people who are getting to Fagari and I want to stop them getting through there, well, I need to bear in mind that if they've captured something like Coastal Morton and they've captured all of these objectives that can flow around these areas on the modded servers, then chances are there's a fairly large spread of ways that they could get to Fagari. Whereas if it's just one possible entry point, maybe they've captured farm over here, they don't have Fagari and they want to go to it, the easiest possible answer is just this main road in front of me from the farm building straight across through province straight into Fagari. And as a preventative style player, I would probably want to be sitting in one of these compounds, tree lines, and just making the most amount of disruption possible in a short space of time. People who run ambushes, people who effectively use their RPGs, people who effectively use machine guns, people who basically just become a thorn in the side to the overall flow of an enemy team are some of the most challenging players in Arma Reforger, and people who, in my view, who are the most important assets of the game. You will regularly find me on any given live stream where I'm trying to be effective in Arma Reforger, setting up traps, setting up ambushes, setting up just pure shows of force along any main road in and around central points. If I wanted to stop people getting into Laruns from the south, I'm sitting up in this tree line causing all sorts of mayhem. If I wanted to stop people getting into Levy, specifically this military base, I'm sat here on the crossroads ready to cause carnage. This is what a Preventer player does. It's how they basically deny areas of the map or certain assets of the map to the enemy team, knocking out key weaponry, knocking out key infantry players who are trying to move across. The amount of times I've hit an RPG on a Jeep just filled with 5 or 6 players, and all of a sudden those people are now 2 or 3 minutes away from the front line again, is such a huge example of how a single player can have an overwhelming impact on the flow of an objective. For example, if the enemy team are approaching to the south of Montignac and they really want to take this objective and they're doing everything they can to do it and they're primarily using this main road, well, if I've only got a handful of defenders on the point, there's no point joining the mess that's going to occur in this town. It makes more sense for me to stem the flow of the actual players coming into the point and operate on this road here and deal with people crossing in. Because if I stop the guys who are flowing to the point, then it's just basically making it easier for people who are on the point to deal with the situation at hand. And once you start to really notice the flow of players across using your map and using intelligence, being the vanilla game or the modded version of the game, you'll be able to be a really effective player that can take out lots and lots of players very quickly with a huge amount of effectiveness. One of the other things I want to talk about in terms of mastering Arma Reforger is also just talking about the general etiquette of the game to some extent. Now, there are a couple of small things that you can do in your gameplay that will really benefit your team on the whole. The first, obviously, being deleting markers from the map if and when you realize that they're active or inactive, because lots of misinformation on your map is not particularly good. But one of the biggest etiquette pieces that I see go wrong in Arma Reforger in terms of teams, working against each other, in terms of working together, is how they build their bases. A really good example of this is Fagari. So this is an example where we're defending people flooding in from the north, but the majority of our supplies are coming in from the south. What I see a lot of guys do is they build up all of their primary resources around the main spawn tent, which tends to be here. And as a result of doing that, they tend to just completely let everything else fall apart. If you're gonna build a base and you've decided, hey, this is my main flag here and I want to defend it to the north, you want to give your relay option a backup spawn to be further away from the point, ideally on your side too, so something like here. And B, you want critical assets like heavy vehicles to not be directly affecting the rest of your team. So for example, in this scenario, I would probably put a heavy vehicle station here, and I would probably put something like a light vehicle station somewhere around here. This means that my teammates, for the purposes of this, have none of their roads obstructed. And if I'm going for a helipad, I'm obviously looking to benefit my teammates by keeping it as clear from any nearby issues or nearby problems as much as humanly possible. So for me, I would probably put this in the back here and then undig some of the trees around it, which is an option. Fuel supply, that's the kind of thing you're going to want near a main road. So it's just a basic placement with a bit of intelligence. You're not obstructing any ways in and out of the point, and you're making sure that those critical assets are where they need to be. Other things as well, like living quarters, of course, encampments, checkpoints, whatever it so happens to be. The command post tends to be here on this objective, so we'll use that as an example. But just building around what you already have. I would probably put the supply depot here on this side so you can easily drop off supplies onto it, because supply depots and ammunition depots are a really easy way for you to get stuff onto the point and drop them off without having to run your supply truck all the way to the command post itself. But in terms of building defensive positions, I would expect to see a bit more of an educated decision around where you're placing assets. So for example, rather than blocking up this road because you may want to use it to advance, blocking up the sides of these roads tend to be more beneficial with defensive positions that you can place around, and also placing defensive positions around or near critical assets but not in the way of main roads. If you were so inclined, you could potentially lock off one side of a road by using something like a bunker, so long as you're leaving another pathway free. One thing I like to do is create a perimeter wall around not only the main tent itself, but also the backups next to it. So I wouldn't just be building necessarily sandbags here around the tent, I would also be looking to build them on the next line over to give us a double layer of coverage that isn't obstructing people in the area. These are really, really effective and really, really useful. And a big key point is to basically assume that all of these fences at some point in the game are going to be destroyed by enemy assets. So clearing the roads, keeping them free of obstructions, but also thinking about, well, hey, look, you know, I've got a helipad here. It would be wise to maybe get some defensive positions near it just to make sure that it's got a bit of coverage from potentially inbound fire, but isn't obstructing the actual helipad itself. That's big brain. But doing lots of really stupid things that I see from people where they, you know, they get themselves like a sandbag line or something, and they just instantly drop it in the road. One of the most common examples I see of this is people, they'll do something along the lines of something like this, where they'll take a bunker or a defensive position or a roadblock or a machine gun nest, and they'll just drop it straight in the middle of the road. Well, if my team now wants to use this main road with any armored assets, they're completely ruined. However, if you were to do something like deleting this asset and putting it somewhere, say here, where it's got direct line of sight onto the road itself, for the most part, and is somewhat nestled away, you're still doing the same amount of effectiveness without causing trouble. So things like that are really, really critical. A good base design for the most part of things is one that's unobstructing your friendlies and making sure that they can get from A to B really easily, whilst also providing them necessary amounts of cover in and out of the base, whether that's sandbag lines that partially obscure the roads but don't completely take out general driving lines, or just blocking up certain areas that you don't want to become choke points. The biggest issue I see with these is that people allow too much openness around the objective and don't think about how they could be spawning assets in such a way that they could be making their lives a little bit easier for their teammates. Now, yes, there will be some obstructions that you probably won't encounter here in Game Master and limitations on the sphere of influence that you'll have on this relay point. But the point still stands. Do not clog up the main roads, do not make those difficult, unless it's roads that you specifically want to tamper with, and make sure that that's communicated to your team. Otherwise, build as many assets as humanly possible that support your general spawn area and your backup spawns, which is any tented object, without necessarily making them overly boxed in and making kill holes for you guys to get out of. These are really simple etiquette things that can improve the quality of gameplay, and things like good helipad placement, things like good supply placement, allow supplies to flow in easier and make your job for your team substantially easier in the long term of defending. And that's a really key point that I'd like to get by people. Hopefully you guys have found this video useful in terms of understanding Arma Reforger a little bit more and learning about some things that can greatly progress your gameplay. And if you did, be sure to drop a like, drop a subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next one.